I'm with Care About Climate, and my pronouns, I'm sorry, they're not presented on there. They're she, her, hers. I am from Houston, Texas, and I am currently in Texas. Very beautiful today. And I will be co-presenting with my colleague Elle on gender and climate action.
Yeah, so hi everyone, welcome. I just wanted to say, Jasmine, I love your earrings. Now that I see it. But anyway, so I'm Elle Vanderkam. I'm currently in Amsterdam at the moment. I'm doing my master thesis and slowly getting to the end of it, which is really exciting. And I'm volunteering for Empodera Clima, which is a program under Care About Climate. And I mean, we'll explain more about the organizations afterwards. But yeah, just I'm kind of new to the organization, but I just find it so fascinating to always, learn more about climate and gender and how they intersect. And so I'm really excited to present the introduction and the basics of what we do and what we consider in Empodera Clima.
So just a couple housekeeping rules that we are going to have. This is a recorded session, so we do ask you to be mindful of that. If you are comfortable with having your image and your voice recorded, then that's wonderful. And if not, then just, please go ahead and shut down your mic and your camera. And we will definitely we'll have a presentation, but we will also have a discussion at the end. So we do invite you guys to share with us your experiences, and we're just going to moderate it a little bit just so we can all have an opportunity to speak in a safe environment. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, sorry, before I move on, we do have a live transcript at the bottom. So if you do need the closed captioning, go ahead and turn those on. It should be at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any issues, just go ahead and message us on the little chat. We do ask you guys, if you're comfortable to do so, to go ahead and introduce yourselves on the chat. Tell us your name, where you're from, what you do, and what you hope to learn, or what you're looking forward to about this session with us.
Yeah, we
So
also decided to do a discussion at the end because we didn't want, a long 90-minute session of just talking at you. And so the more you participate, the more lovely it will be. So yeah, we're excited for it.
okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen so we can get started on our presentation. Elle, can you see the screen? Everything's great?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So we are going to be discussing gender and climate action and how gender actually plays a substantial role in climate action and climate justice. So as I mentioned before, we are a part of Care About Climate. So Care About Climate is actually a nonprofit established in the United States, and it was founded in 2014 to build momentum for climate action through international cooperation leading up to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference in Paris. So Care About Climate continued to build a global cooperation platform designed to support the implementation of the Paris Agreement through volunteer-led programming. And we do have a lot of programs within Care About Climate. And Elle and I are fortunate enough to be able to work with them, and that is Empodera Clima.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know if I mentioned, but I'm the website officer for Empodera Clima, and Ruth is a researcher for the organization. And what we essentially aim to do as, the program under Care About Climate is to really enforce the gender agenda on in climate solutions. And so we provide an educational platform to raise awareness about, the impacts of climate change on women and girls in the global south. And we also emphasize and encourage the need for women's leadership in climate action. We provide content in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French. And we really Our target audience are students, researchers, activists, and passionate youth, especially in the developing world, as they do not usually have access to materials about climate change or climate justice in their native languages. And
So just, oh, sorry, Elle, were you going to say something?
no, go ahead.
Okay, so just kind of to briefly touch on everything that we're going to be discussing. So we are going to be discussing gender and how it ties up to the climate action. We're going to talk about the climate crisis, climate justice, intersectionality, gender and climate, gender inequality, and some of the steps that we can take for a more inclusive climate movement, and a call for action. And then, as we mentioned before, we are going to have a discussion, just based on what we talk about today, and just trying to apply what we when we go over to our communities and our personal lives, and how it could benefit us in the future.
Great. So to start off the presentation, we wanted to provide a very basic, recap of what gender actually means, which to some is evident, to others is really, brand new information. And so I wanted to go over, this Venn diagram that really illustrates the difference between sex and gender as different concepts rather than, our culture kind of always mingling it to mean the same thing. So on the one side of the Venn diagram, we see that sex is something that humans, non-human animals, and cells have. And it's typically divided in a binary fashion between male and female, and increasingly recognized as intersex, in which an individual can have the biological traits of male and female to different extents, of course. And the focus of sex is the biology of the individual. And so, the focus on the anatomy, the physiology, chromosomes, hormones, gene expression, and behavior. So that's sex on the one side, but then every individual also has a gender. And so that's the other side of the Venn diagram, which, so far it has only been proven that gender is unique to humans. It's a multifaceted and complex what am I saying? Multifaceted and complex concept, and it exists on a continuum, which I will be explaining in the next slide. And it can change over time. It can differ from sex. You can have a gender that is more traditionally tied to your sex or not at all. The continuum usually goes from feminine to masculine. You can have different preferred pronouns from her, him, they, and it usually stems from, well, gender is created by a social, cultural, philosophical, psychological, political basis rather than the biological, scientific traits of an individual. And what's also important to note is that gender can be influenced by, this box next to the Venn diagram, by society, environment, experience, cultures, politics, history, and more in an individual's life. Next slide, please. And so now that we have, distinguished the difference between sex and gender, I actually love this diagram, and I always use it to, to introduce the concept of gender to people. It's somewhat childish, yes, but it's, the genderbread person. I love it. So here we see a gingerbread person on one side with emphasis on their brain, their heart, their sexual organs, and the expression. And this all interconnects with an individual's gender. And so here we see that the brain relates to gender identity, which is often about how you think about yourself, and the chemistry that composes you, and how you interpret your gender identity. So either you feel that you are on one side of the spectrum, that you're a woman, or on the opposite side of the spectrum as a man. And then there are many different gender identities in between, with the middle being genderqueer. Then the gender expression is often for how you demonstrate your gender. So most of the time it's through the way that you act, dress, behave, or interact with others. And usually that goes again on the spectrum of feminine and masculine, with many different expressions in between. Then biological sex, as I previously explained, it really focuses on the scientific, objective, measurable organs, the hormones and chromosomes that one obtains. And again, you can see that it's female on one side, male on the other, and then intersex. And then, again, it's a spectrum. And then finally, we have sexual orientation as a plus, as a final point, that it's, it relates to who you are physically, spiritually, and emotionally attracted to based on their sex and gender, or in relation to your own. And that's, just the basics of gender for, a fresh little recap for everyone.
So the climate crisis, the climate change is a defining crisis of our time. No corner of the globe is immune, as many of you have already realized and, maybe even experienced. Globally, we are facing many consequences due to this crisis, from rising temperatures, fueling degradation, to extreme weather disasters and events. There's also food and water insecurity and economic disruption. As we all know, global warming is one of the leading causes and greatest contributors to world hunger, malnutrition, exposure to disease, and declining access to water. And climate change is a major threat to international peace and security, and it is a risk multiplier, which often makes challenges even worse as time progresses. And so to fully understand the extent of these consequences, we must build an inclusive climate platform that recognizes the importance of gender in climate action. And so we really want to reiterate the fact that we need to pay more attention at that correlation and how that these consequences do affect gender, persons from different genders.
So this brings us to climate justice. And what is climate justice? And as a political science student, I'm going to bring in a democratic theory or a democratic principle, which I think is, important to illustrate what climate justice means. And the all affected principle basically means that, in a democracy, all those affected by a collective decision should be included in the decision. It seems extremely basic, but it's difficult to achieve and sometimes just not. And so climate justice really focuses on considering climate change as much more than, solely an environmental or scientific issue, because it recognizes that it has political, social, economic, and ethical considerations that need to be need to be part of the climate solution. And so climate justice really focuses on, the first step being that we need to recognize that key groups are differently affected by climate change. And then secondly, that climate impacts can increase social inequalities throughout the world.
So climate justice, as we all know, is taking urgent action against climate change and its impacts. And so I wanted to kind of just talk a little bit about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Sustainable Development Goal 13, which is on climate action. And there are 5 targets from the SD goals, and they have they include strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related disasters, integrating climate change measures into policies and planning, and building knowledge and capacity to meet climate change. And then we also have the more kind of like organizational ones, which is implementing a UN framework, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and promoting mechanisms to raise capacity for climate planning and management. So it's really reassuring to know that, you know, such global organizations are actively trying to find, trying to study the impacts that climate change have on different genders. And so we definitely want to keep learning, and we want to keep working with these organizations to make sure that all genders have a voice and all populations are included in, you know, these discussions, because currently, unfortunately, that's not the case as much as we would like it to be.
So an important part of climate justice and climate solutions being inclusive is the consideration of intersectionality. And for those of you who don't know what intersectionality is, it is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, which has really revolutionized the way that we see social injustice in social sciences. And it's basically a term to describe how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics can intersect with one another and overlap. And these, you know, the lived experiences and experiences of discrimination of a Black woman will be different from those of a white woman or a Black man, for example. Um, and yeah, just, you know, this thing that she discovered, let's say, or that she just described in our reality, completely, you know, flipped the switch in the way that we look at life, because suddenly, you know, overlapping identities became um, sources of systemic discrimination and social injustice. And so, yeah, this concept of intersectionality became, you know, immediately a catalyst for activism and change, because suddenly considering how, you know, individuals have these overlapping identities became a way to dismantle the systemic discrimination and social injustice rather than ignoring the realities of our society. And so this really is important in climate change, because we are seeing how different identities may change the reality of how people are impacted by climate change. Next slide, Ruth, please. Yeah, so here now to, you know, kind of bring in together the elements of gender and climate. I mean, we've been kind of talking about it the whole time, but, you know, the most important thing to note from this whole presentation is that climate change is not gender neutral. And yeah, I apologize. At the moment, I'm going to be talking very binary, women and men, but we will talk about different communities afterwards. So yes, so climate change has been proven that, you know, it impacts women differently than men. And we see that women commonly face higher risks and greater burdens from the impacts of climate change, especially in situations of poverty. And, you know, with the reality that the majority of the of the world's population in poverty are women, you can see directly that most people who are impacted are women. We see this especially with climate change impacting the scarcity of resources, or causing the scarcity of resources, the loss of income, displacement, unrest, lack of safety, and also, you know, increases the discrimination and sexual violence against women. But this list is not limited at all, and there are many more ways that climate change impact women in particular. And I guess as an illustrative example, I always go back to agriculture, because currently we do see a massive inequality, you know, gender inequality within the agricultural world. because we see that they have there's a gender yield gap of approximately 20 to 30%. And this already means that, on a day-to-day basis today, a male managed farm will be 20 to 30% more productive than a female led farm or agricultural land. However, what's interesting to note is that women account for 45 to 80% of agricultural workers in developing nations. And in developing nations, we also see that women hold under 10 or 20% of land ownership in agricultural land. And so here we see a huge discrepancy between who is, physically working on the land and who is owning the land. And as a consequence, women are continuously excluded from decision making on the access to and the use of land and resources critical to their livelihoods. The access to assets, credits, and treatments by markets and formal institutions make it much more difficult to sustain agricultural lands, through, their ability to buy fertilizers or tools or essential resources to protect themselves from, uh, you know, climate change or other situations. And, at the end of the day, we do see a global gender gap in earnings and productivity, again, to show that, the actual monetary value, women are making between 30 and 80% of what men earn annually in agricultural scenes or agricultural economies. And of course, like this number is huge, 30 to 80%, but it of course depends on the continent, or the country. And so here, like to focus on this discrepancy of who's actually working on the land and who owns the land, who has a say in what goes on with the land, or whether or not they can buy tools and fertilizers to actually protect their land. You can tell that women are much more vulnerable to climate change with agriculture. And so they're much more vulnerable to have a, suddenly much more scarcity of resources. They're more prone to a loss of income, displacement, unrest, and, the rest of the list, simply because of systemic discrimination, and that climate change just makes them much more vulnerable to these situations.
Just a couple more facts on how climate change affects women differently than men. It's been reported and proven that extreme weather actually kills more women than men. During a cyclone in Bangladesh in 1991, 90% of the fatalities were women. When men were actually safer due to their education, freer migration, and fewer overall constraints, in comparison to women. And actually, that's actually kind of, or sorry, no, that's actually terrible for women, just because, had they given the opportunities, they could actually become assets. So women are at higher risk post-disaster of being placed in unsafe, overcrowded shelters due to lack of assets such as savings, property, or land, just like Elle was discussing. In the context of disasters that require mobility, cultural constraints on women's movements may hinder their timely escape. Again, access to shelter or access to even healthcare. The researchers suggested in the study that this was actually most likely linked to cultural norms that restrict women from leaving their homes without a male chaperone. And we have come to find out that a lot of communities where women do suffer in terms of like cultural norms, these are cultural norms that go back years, and so there needs to be a little bit more of an education for that, and trying to give the same or equal rights and opportunities to these women, and the same amount of resources. Women's unequal participation in decision-making processes compound inequalities and often prevent women from fully contributing to climate-related planning, policy making, and implementation. And therein lies the problem of why women often get left behind, because their needs and their necessities are just not they're not considered when it comes to kind of planning for all of these consequences that may occur in the future. Most decision makers are men in climate, and so that does leave women and non-binary persons behind. And this is something that definitely needs to change, to just build a more equitable climate action foundation globally. And to talk about gender inequality. So prior to disasters, members of the LGBTQI plus community may not have access to the same assets, resources, and information as the general population because of potential exclusion, isolation, and restricted social networks. And unfortunately, we see that on the rise. LGBTQI plus youth actually make up 40% of homelessness in the US, as climate change continues to misplace more and more people, with the rising natural disasters increasing, and that kind of just puts them even more at a greater risk of experiencing these extreme weather conditions, be it a heat wave or, I'm from Texas, so hurricane season is extremely dangerous for a lot of people, especially the homeless population. We recently had a huge snowstorm that ended up killing people, homeless people who just couldn't find the right shelters. And so it's definitely a topic that needs more research. Also, gender-based violence, especially for the trans community, increases significantly after climate-related disasters. And so, this already vulnerable community continues to be more vulnerable to climate change and continues to be marginalized as more actions occur and more discussion is made, and so we need to make sure to give them a voice as well. So these charts from the Carbon Brief organization kind of reflect how gender inequality and vulnerability are interrelated. So on graph A, you see the more gender equality a place is, the higher their vulnerability is. And so, but yeah, so you can see on the graphic, if we reduce that gender inequality, that vulnerability increases of these communities. And so, this trend actually just shows us how important and crucial it is to kind of shift that conversation and to be more inclusive when it comes to different genders and populations. And on graph B, you see the relationship between gender inequality and climate action. And as gender inequality exists, climate action reduces, and that's because of the same concept of, if we do not have an inclusive conversation, then we can't help everyone. There's always someone left out of the conversation. And so if we don't learn and if we don't recognize their needs and, their vulnerabilities, then we can't really help them, or they can't be helped in their communities. And so this kind of information just shows us, that this is a problem that needs to be solved, and this is an actual problem that we're facing worldwide. It's not just in the first world or the third world, like everywhere. We will see this being a trend, and it's an unnecessary trend. Everyone deserves to have their voice heard and their gender included. And when it comes to health, actually, a study between male and female, and as Elle said, there is like a very binary trend of just having those kinds of studies, which also needs to change. But women are more likely to be affected by climate change impacts on their health. And this is worldwide, again, by the Carbon Brief Organization. If you see this graph, like you see 3 different colors, orange female, purple male, and the gray is no difference. And then comparing through all these studies, or looking at all these studies, 2/3 of studies will find that women face greater health risks due to climate change. You have death and injury from extreme weather, food insecurity, mental illness, poor reproductive and maternal health. And we do see males have they face more impacts from infectious diseases, but women are also on there, and so we just need to find a way to make sure that women have or make sure that women have more of a say in these discussions, because they are affected so much. And it's information like this that we just can't ignore, and we need to kind of be more open about it, and we need to be able to discuss how specifically women and non-binary persons are very vulnerable and continue to be marginalized in climate action discussions. So, for an inclusive climate movement, women in food production, community management, natural resource and biodiversity management, education of children and family care, women are actually really resilient, and they it's been proven that women are actually really great when it comes to, all of these different concepts. The women are also at the heart of the potential of climate solutions. So recognizing and supporting the activities and needs of women is essential for socio-economic development. And again, women in leadership positions at any level, nationally, locally, or at community levels, they make visible differences in natural disaster responses, both in emergency rescue and evacuation efforts, and in post-disaster reconstruction. And so again, it would be a benefit to have women included. Not only is it what's right, but they have so much to offer. The LGBTQI plus community, they have to be liberated from oppression and social limitations. Further studying the impacts of climate crisis consequences on the queer community will inform and lead decision makers to implement better practices to help these communities. I'm happy to see that there are organizations who are already kind of like working on this and snowballing these kinds of studies to learn more about how the LGBTQI plus community has to deal with climate change. And I hope that there's more inclusivity with that community as well, because it's just necessary to have everyone in the discussion. And so Ella and I have a call for action based on gender and climate action.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess to conclude our session, or rather our moment of where we talk at you, we just wanted to conclude with the statement that, when we look at all of this information, the way that we're approaching climate solutions hasn't been inclusive enough. And so we would really emphasize that effective solutions and change can only occur when all genders are included in climate action. So, I mean, now we would love to, invite you to ask any questions. If you feel comfortable to, please just turn on your microphone and ask away. Or, you can always throw your question into the chat and we'll address it. Yeah, it's as you wish. And then afterwards we'll go into a discussion. We've prepared some questions, and so we would love for you to participate in that. So if you have any questions, please go ahead. Or maybe just any thoughts.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess this is a question for either of you or both of you. What kind of brought you to this work?
So yeah, I can answer that one. And Elle, you can also obviously answer. So well, I really enjoy learning about how the climate crisis affects everyone in different, not only here in the US, but in the global South. I really didn't appreciate how the United States wasn't as active in trying to kind of mitigate efforts, or even, input some adaptability efforts into policy. And so I I really do believe that climate change and climate action needs to be a little bit more present in the United States, just because we do emit a lot more damage to the environment with our various organizations. And also, being from Texas, I have had a lot of experiences with natural disasters. We've had a lot of extreme hurricanes in my area, and I just definitely feel that youth need to be more inclusive, or not included in that conversation, and especially women. I like learning about how women are often marginalized in this discussion. Is, for me, it's offensive, and I really disagree that that's still, a problem that we have to fight for our place at the table. And I really want to make sure that if I can bring upon that change, that I'm doing my best to do that.
Yeah, I guess to add on to that, I mean, I don't know, there's a lot of things that brought me to this type of work. um, I would say, again, kind of to add on to Ruth's point. I mean, I'm a bit of an international nomad. I grew up a little bit all over the world. Most of my childhood was spent in Southeast Asia, and then I moved to Switzerland, which was, kind of like two opposites, of a coin. And there, in Southeast Asia, I was really seeing how women were impacted by climate. Monsoon season would come over, like the markets, and you could just see it in your day-to-day life. And then in Switzerland, I wouldn't see that much of the climate change issue, but then I would just see again that women were just continuously marginalized, in any sort of solutions, on all levels. And so just little by little, I just kind of really got into gender and intersectionality. I'm even writing my thesis right now. It's an intersectional critique on algorithms. And I mean, that's another story, but I'm super interested in intersectionality. And for me, I just feel like I have seen how women are disproportionately impacted by climate change throughout, my childhood and everything, in different countries. And so that's kind of how I got, completely fascinated by this topic. So yeah, and also just not even gender, but also just seeing, just watching the news and seeing how homeless people or people of different backgrounds, the BIPOC community being much more prone to different types of health issues because of climate change, or senior people, or but then our solutions are just so not, it just assumes that everyone is the same, or it just, and for me it just doesn't make sense. And that's how I'm reading more and more and trying my best to learn about it, so we can encourage more effective solutions, rather than kind of you know not considering the reality as it is.
Are there any other questions?
I actually have a couple of thoughts. Like, so going into this discussion, a big part of the reason why I'm here is because I was wondering about like the specific impacts of climate change on like like the trans community or like the queer community. And what was striking to me is that, and it hit me that it's like we just don't have a lot of that information, because we don't necessarily know how queer folks are impacted, because in a lot of respects, like, queer and trans issues just aren't taken as seriously as they should be. And so I just wanted to say that, this was this was pretty illuminating. And I think that I think that there's a niche that desperately needs filling. But that's my 2 cents. I just I had a lot of thoughts about this, and I wanted to get them out and see if anybody else had thoughts.
I mean, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing it up, because I mean, when Ruth and I were, preparing for this presentation, we were just constantly realizing that, the research that's out there is extremely binary. And if inclusive, okay, let's put inclusive in quotation marks, solutions are presented, it is again quite, most of the time, quite binary. And I mean, okay, bravo already for considering women into the conversation, but that's, we're not done yet. And that's really something that we need to emphasize again as the youth, that, just considering women is a great thing, but we're not done yet, and we have so much work to get through.
Yeah, absolutely. I recently had the opportunity to write an article about that, about how how climate change is an LGBTQI plus issue. And we've been doing my research on that. It was, besides a couple of peer-reviewed articles, it was really difficult to even find information in the mainstream. And I found that, quite frankly, shocking, because, at least in the US, we are seeing a lot more protesting and a lot more advocacy for all of these marginalized groups. And so when I had a hard time finding that information, I was alarmed. And as Elle said, during preparation for this session, we did have a discussion about this too, about how it's not okay to not have this information yet. And that's why I added that fact about there are organizations who are currently fundraising for these studies, because it's no secret that we need this work to be done as well. But the little research that I could find, there is a huge impact that the queer community has on climate change, or that climate change has on the queer community. And not only from what, we talked about on this presentation, but I also found other alarming statistics about, how there is a lack of shelters for queer community, especially post disasters. Often there's not any place for them to go, just because they don't fit that binary, politic, essentially. And I also found out that, during I think it was Katrina in New Orleans, during after that hurricane, there was a lot of violence against the trans community. And it's so, and then also, to add to that natural disaster, there was also, like, the recovery efforts during that. They limited their resources to only binary people, because, a lot of forms, they don't give you even like an other option. It's just male or female. And, you know, that's ridiculous because we don't live in that world. And essentially, we never lived in that world. But even now, so when we're supposed to be more inclusive and more respectful of, you know, everyone's gender, we still haven't gotten to the point where, hey, like, you know, if you're not male or female, you know, just put this or put that. And that is a problem, you know, because we're limiting these resources to that community that desperately needs them. And so it's definitely a topic that warrants more discussion and more research. And I hope that, you know, we get somewhere better with that very soon, especially as, you know, the climate crisis escalates. And we reach a point where maybe adaptation is like the most that we can do at this point. Hopefully not, right? Like, we're obviously working on it and we're trying to make sure that we do our part. But, you know, in order to do that, we do need to make sure that all voices are heard and every gender is included. Thank you so much for your comments. It's definitely a very good point.
Thank you guys so much for your responses as well. I really appreciate it.
Great. Does anyone have any other comment or any question before we move on to our discussion or our prepared questions for you? Okay, great.
Okay, yeah, so Elle and I were talking about kind of building a conversation based on, like, you know, the different things that we talked about. And so we really want to apply our ideas, but also your personal ideas on gender to, you know, everything, basically, to the general conversation on climate action. And so we do, this is a safe space, you know, we want to remind you that if you are more than welcome to give us, you know, your comments or like your responses, or you can add them to the chat and we'll read them out for you if you don't want to share your voice, because we are still recording. But yeah, like, we are very excited to hear from you guys and, you know, to learn everyone's different perspectives, as different as they may be. And again, like, if you have a comment or a question or a response, you know, just go ahead and turn on your microphone and just let us know. So one of the first questions that we thought about, so what does gender mean to you? You know, it's like, it might be not be something that you talk about all the time or that you even think about all the time, but everyone, it may mean something different to everyone. So would anyone like to share? I'll give you like a minute or two, like, no rush. I know it can be a bit of an existential question to some people as well.
Yeah, I can go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
So I'm actually a gender studies student at Eckerd, which was like why I joined, because like I was so excited about it. And so like gender is kind of like the performance that you give of like who you are to how you represent your identity. And so I've always thought of it as like just like a performance. Like, how do you do gender instead of like, do you have it or are you it, but how do you perform it?
Thank you for sharing, Christina. That's actually a very interesting, I haven't heard that response before, but yeah, based on even what Elle was saying at the beginning of the presentation, you know, there's so many different factors that play into gender and your own personal gender role. So, you know, it's a really refreshing perspective for sure.
I have as you might be able to tell. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. I was just gonna proceed if no one had questions, but
cool. Cool. Yeah, I love this question because as someone who is non-binary, like I have thought through this question like hundreds of thousands of times over. And one of the big things that made me start questioning not even just my gender, but my relationship with gender is like gaining the knowledge that gender is a social construct. It is something that it's not a hard and set like binary the way a lot of people tend to think that it is. And in fact, it's been argued by people far smarter than me that like colonialism was kind of what brought us that strict, like, you are a man or you are a woman, take your pick. But there are cultures like all over the world that have different experiences with gender, like multiple genders. And I definitely agree that there's a performance aspect of it. And it's and maybe I don't have like a hard and fast answer, because I'm also autistic, and so gender is a very nebulous concept for me anyway. But it's just I basically picked what felt best. Is like, it's like gender as sort of a costume, and it's just like, what do you feel the most comfortable in, like in terms of people's perceptions of you, in terms of self-image, in terms of the way you want to present yourself. And I don't know if I have an easy answer, but I have a lot of thoughts about the topic.
That's excellent. Yeah, it can be very, or it should be at least very individualistic, what gender means to a person and what they identify as. And I think that's something that a lot of people have a hard time recognizing, especially when they're used to just, male, female. But, hopefully all of us in this chat at least know that that's not the case at all. It's beyond that. So our next question, are you aware of your gender every day? How are you aware of your gender? There's some, as a woman, I definitely am aware of my gender. I don't know if I would say every day, but there are certain instances where I am throughout the day, when there's people who sexualize you, maybe when you're going out for a run. Or when I go somewhere with like my brother or my male friend and they don't talk to me, but they talk to them. Or I go to a restaurant and like they give them the check when I was the one that was going to pay, like there's different things like that. So, but what about you guys? How do you guys, if you are aware of your gender, like what makes you aware of it? Or is it, something different? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be like an outside factor, right? It can just be your own kind of like therapy.
Yeah, I love everything everybody's been saying so far. I feel like I have some more questions than answers, but I'm learning. And yeah, I feel like for me, what makes me aware is definitely like the sexualization and like going out and not wanting to wear like super like makeup or anything like dresses or things like that, because I'm just like aware that other people will be like see me, and so sometimes I just like modify the way that I express my gender because I don't want attention. And that's definitely something that I like think about every now and then. And in the spaces that I'm in, like what is going to get me the least amount of attention. And it also depends on the day, like every day is different. So I like what you also were saying too when you were just like explaining, or like the in your presentation about like it changes throughout your life and like even throughout your year and days. So yeah, I guess I don't know if I answered the question, but those are my thoughts on like um, my awareness of my gender, like day to day. Like it's just different every day.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely, your outside factors can definitely contribute on how you feel, and it doesn't have to be just you. It can be your family, it can be outside factors at work, at school, um anywhere. Even when you watch the news, when you see the BIPOC community suffering, it makes you think, oh, like, would that happen to me, like as a woman, or as trans, or anything, from comparing yourself to other people on television or on the media. It happens quite a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like sorry, I don't want to take up like all the discussion time, but with like even just like my own family, it can be really tricky sometimes because my parents are very like, like man and woman, and I've grown up with so many of these like gender roles like trying to be pushed onto me that I've been very resistant, and like it's made me go like in the other direction where I like use chainsaws and like do all the stuff that like I was told I couldn't do. But I also don't want to like shape my life around like what other people think. But also, yeah, just like within my family, it can be tricky because it's like you're a girl, go help your mom in the kitchen, and like you're a guy, go like help dad do yard work stuff. And it's just very, that's how I grew up, and I have always been resistant towards that. Like I never liked it. I was like, I don't want to do that. Like keep me out of this. Um, but yeah, that can be tricky. And then like little things that you don't realize can be triggering, like when somebody calls you like young lady or like girly. And I'm just like, do not talk to me like that. Just like things I'm still recognizing that bother me about like how people perceive me.
Yeah, I think that's some great points, because I mean, again, for me, I completely agree with all of this. Every day I turn on the news and I'm like, oh, that's sexist, or there's some gender analysis. Like my gender analysis radar is always on these days, especially because of I'm study what I'm studying. But something that I kind of flipped my view on recently is, before I kind of saw it a bit negatively, and I was kind of always been like, yeah, but why do I have to face this discrimination? um and I mean, again, like, this is talking from a very privileged um perspective, from every other aspect of my life. But like, someone just mentioned to me, and it was just, I had a conversation where it was just, my experience as a woman makes me realize that other people, or how do I say this, that my experience as a woman allows me to understand discrimination on another extent, simply because I'm a woman. And ever since, I've kind of just embraced being a woman, and kind of not being in the male domination perspective. And now recently I've kind of just been like, oh yeah, I'm so glad that I have my gender radar on, like, because I'm a woman, like I can understand things differently, and kind of, it's, I don't know, I kind of flipped the switch recently, and it's kind of a beautiful way to see everything now.
Yeah, and Jasmine, just to kind of go on what you said, as we mentioned, traditionally, that sets back women sometimes. Traditions are beautiful, right? Everyone has their customs and all of that, but unfortunately, there are environments in which that isolates women from resources. And I recently was a part of a different conference where I spoke to another attendee, and I asked them, this question, like, are you aware of your gender? Or why do you think that women have a harder time? I think she was from like Ghana, and she was saying that, I asked her, why do you think women in Ghana might face hardships when it comes to post-disaster events, or even just general climate change consequences? And she did bring up traditions and like the norms that are placed on women and only women, where they have to be at the house, they have to respect their elders and men, no matter what age. And, you know, it's definitely something that we don't think about because maybe it's just not as popular where we're from or what we know or what we even see. But it's still a very interesting and deeply rooted problem where, you know, women are giving these gender roles where they're not allowed to do anything outside of those. And so I definitely, like, I came from like a very macho environment growing up, so I completely understand where you're coming from with that. And yeah, growing up, from, you know, from a very young age, I was obviously very aware of my gender because I was made aware of it. You know, like, it is your job to understand your gender and your gender roles and to like comply with those roles. But, you know, we definitely need to, but even if there are traditional senses to that, in other places, you know, that doesn't, well, in my opinion, right, it doesn't mean that women don't get to be allowed to have the same resources or the same opportunities. You know, there should definitely be like equitable practices there for all genders. So yeah, that's a very important point to talk about as well, and to you know, think about. And so our next question, in what ways, well, we already kind of talked about what ways does gender impact our lives and our lifestyle, but just to like move forward to kind of like going back to like the climate crisis. So what's considering the climate crisis, in what ways is your gender affected? And here I know that we went over like, you know, certain things that happen around the world, but in your communities where you're from, do you ever see kind of like the discrepancy between how women and men are affected? Or have you personally been affected a certain way when it comes to maybe a natural disaster or like a just like a general consequence due to climate change?
You know, so last September in my neck of the woods, we went through the Almeida fire, and it I live in Medford, and it, you know, and it kind of it hit like bits of Medford, but Phoenix and Talent, a couple of neighboring towns, were hit the hardest. And one of the, like, one statistic that sticks out to me is that, you know, is that like 40% of, like 40% of homeless folks are LGBT, and there was a lot of people that were very like badly affected by this fire. And I work with a lot of folks who were left homeless, who are, you know, living on the Greenway when the fire swept through. And I mean, it's awful from a from you know, from an environmental standpoint, but it's also awful from like an economic standpoint and from a humanitarian standpoint. And I'm just thinking about, like, you know, all the ways that these issues intersect. And I don't know, I feel like I had a point, but maybe it was just thoughts. Regardless, like I know that, like, I'm acutely aware of my gender, both in terms of my appearance to outsiders and what I know to be true of myself. That I see the people that I work with on a regular basis, and I think, I have like it would take one big disaster like the one we had back in September to make me and my family, to put me and my family in that situation as well. And it's frightening to think about. I mean, even my neighborhood was on like a level 2 evacuation notice for like over 24 hours. And that was terrifying. But that was one of the things that was kind of going through my head, like when this question was brought up. And yeah, I'll stop there. But yeah, a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
So there's a lot of things with that question that I can think of. But the first thing I thought of was like migration, like people crossing or coming from like South America, like the Mexico and different parts of like this global South. And like how like just like so many layers to that, but like predominantly I think of like pro-life movements and the fact that women can't like don't have access to birth control and can't prevent themselves from being able, like can't not have kids sometimes, and then they become responsible for those children and they have a really hard time crossing the border. Like you can't cross with kids as easily as like young men can, and that's who predominantly crosses the desert here. And it's just a lack of like that education, and then also like those resources that affect women predominantly, because I just think about people who cross the border, and then also like why the demographics are so different for men and women, and then also trans people who cross the border and like don't have, when they like are trying to be, they deport them, they don't deport them back to where they like originally are from most of the time, and so then they get trapped on the border, and then within the border there's like all these dynamics that trans people are just like at a huge disadvantage for like finding resources to be able to get lawyers, get what they need in order to be able to, and a lot of times they're fleeing because they are trans and because they're facing that discrimination. So yeah, all of those things remind like, and the ultimately like it's the US intervention in those countries, but also our extracting of resources and destroying the environment that has led to that. So yeah, those are just like my thoughts about all those things.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Jasmine.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, also thank you for mentioning, that migration is, the most, the migration that's going on in America and everything. A lot of the, climate crisis has a big impact in that. And again, that impacts women, but a lot of what we're reading from day to day, the reports, kind of just doesn't really mention that. So it's a great point that you point out, you mentioned.
Yeah, definitely. And something that a lot of people forget too is, the global pandemic is a result of, our poor relationship with different organisms. And, look at how this pandemic has affected women worldwide, and LGBTQI communities, because, if they already have high unemployment rates, how do we think this pandemic is affecting them? How many women had to leave their jobs to take care of children because childcare wasn't, like available. Women who are in poverty, people who are homeless, they I think it was 22% of LGBTQI people are homeless every year in the United States. It's difficult. It becomes even more difficult. Like all of these hardships are exacerbated by, all of these consequences, and there's nothing in place to help with that. And so it's definitely a problem that needs to be solved, and or at least we need to start that conversation so that we can have good solutions and good policies implemented to help all of these people. So the next question I have for y'all, so is your community impacted by the climate crisis, and how does your gender play a role? I guess that was kind of like similar to the last question we had, or at least y'all answered it that way, which is awesome. You guys are all ahead of us. But are there any, notes that you want to bring up now that we're all here talking and like discussing openly all of these impacts?
One thing like that I've noticed, not as much for like local community as much, but like the movement in and of itself. I'm finding with a lot of like climate change and renewable energy work, like I'm in Florida right now. I'm stationed in Florida. I'm at school in Florida right now, but I'm from North Carolina, and I'm from right outside of a city, so it's really rural, really red, and it's really hard to like advocate for climate change there. But one thing that I have found is in the communities of folks who care about the environment, like old school 70s environmentalists, their focus is why are we working on all of this other stuff like racial issues, like gender issues, all of these things, and not seeing the intersection and saying this is distracting us from the real the real thing here, environmental problems and protections. And so a lot of things I've noticed in like climate groups, especially because I work a lot in nonpartisan spaces, is that people are like, why are we working in all of these other things when we should be focusing on climate? Um, and so it's something like constantly battling that I'm like really conscious that like I am a queer woman in a space where people don't really like respect or care about my identity as much, but only care about climate change and not seeing those intersections. I haven't run into that problem in Florida as much, so for somehow it's probably because I'm on a college campus. But it's definitely like something I ran into in North Carolina a lot with that. Yeah, they are. And it's something like a lot of pieces of the same puzzle that people don't see and that they're scared to see. Oh, the gender theory I could get into with that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Brilliantly said. I agree. It's definitely a lot of people will try to hold us back when we kind of try to talk about gender that way. It's like, why are we talking about gender? We're talking about climate change, and that's what should be like at the top of the list. But that nexus is what we're trying to, advocate about, right? Like we need representation, we need inclusion, we need information, we need resources. And it's unfortunate that a lot of people don't understand that. And sometimes, even if it happens to someone they know, it's always like an excuse, right? Like it's always, you just want to talk about women and feminism and, all of that. And that's not what this is about. No, this is exactly what it's about. Like this is part of that. And so we need to talk about it. But yeah, well said. Absolutely.
And yeah, to add to that, I think that's our role as the youth, right? To kind of relate back to what Power Shift is trying to do, is to empower the youth to exactly, step up and, you know, tell especially the older generations, or rather the more traditional line of thinking, that it's not okay to just leave them as separate concepts. Like they need to merge because they are very strongly interconnected.
We have, so our next question, oh no, that's not it. There, I think I skipped this one. How does intersectionality affect climate action in your community? So Elle spoke about intersectionality, which is a very interesting concept that, it really does, it is a big part of who we are. And it does include our gender. So do you guys have any comments on this or any thoughts on intersectionality?
I guess I would just say like it is the only way like we're gonna affect any change. Like we cannot continue the way that like I learned about environmentalism in college was like it always felt like something was missing, you know, like we would talk about like all these environmentalists and like their studies and their research and like climate change is happening and it's impending, but like without talking about any other issues that have any effect on it. And so once I left that space, I started to gain the understanding of intersectionality, and like nothing else makes sense anymore um, unless you consider it all, you know, like literally like one thing, it's all connected. And I studied ecology too, which was really interesting because like ecology is the interconnectedness of everything in nature. Um, but that human ecology is also a line of like or field of research. And I think, yeah, like it's just like a giant web of interconnectedness, and we really can't like address one issue without other things being thought about as well. And I don't want to live in a like society where we don't like we just pick and choose the issues that we think are important because they don't affect us directly, you know. Like I don't, yeah, I think that's yeah, intersectionality is just like a really cool concept. Concept reality.
I actually love the way that you say that. It's just, intersectionality is the only way, like that's exactly perfectly said. We also have a thought or a comment by Lauren, which links perfectly to what you just said, Jasmine. Yeah, basically Lauren is saying, how do we get through to the people who are not affected, and get, a wider understanding on the link between all the issues that we're fighting more for? Like, how do we get people to care, or especially the people who are not affected, how do we get them to care and actually consider intersectionality? I think that's a great point, and I guess that's that's what we're fighting for, educating, and it's again, yeah, how do you teach people to care for others, right? It's a very difficult thing to achieve, and I think again that's our role as the youth to dismantle this, you know, these exclusive solutions. But yeah, it's a very good question. How do we actually do it? If anyone has any comments.
I certainly don't have any answers, but I think that like some kind of cultural shift is needed, like especially, and I can only speak for America because America is the only place I've lived. It's all that I know. But this we have this pervasive culture of just rugged individualism, and whenever something goes wrong like in a person's life, like it must be that person's fault. They didn't do good enough, they didn't do well enough. And I think we need to shift our way of thinking towards like more collectivist principles of like we need to, and maybe this can be done through education, um but it's like we need to relearn how to fight for the collective benefit of everybody and not just for ourselves.
That's a good point. There are so many issues that, or sorry, not issues. If and when women and non-binary groups are given the opportunity to have their needs met, it can lead to a more prosperous place to live. Removing that wage gap, for example, that is going to lead to more prosperous economies worldwide, and to have better resources in healthcare. That's going to lead to healthier lifestyles, healthier children, a healthier future. And Lauren just added some information on here as well, a comment.
Yeah, she said that, or Lauren said that there's so much education around the psychology and the human experience that needs to be taught at a young age. And I also added to the fact that there's so much education about this topic that needs to be unlearned from the rest of us. And Lauren also added that people in leadership roles also need to know that they have to have these conversations, which is also very important.
Yeah. And I mean, this entire conversation pretty much answers this question, right? How can we help our communities as we adapt to climate crisis consequences? Let's be proactive about including gender, right, to the conversation. Let's let's elect good officials. Let's advocate for this very important issue, and let's fund the right research so that we can all learn how we can help each other, and reach that equality that we need to be healthy and safe, because as I mentioned, like the climate crisis isn't going anywhere, so we need to make sure that we're doing our part and what we need to do to mitigate or adapt, depending on where we live and what these consequences may be.
Also, just on an individual level, just we can all learn to be a bit more considerable creatures, a bit more sensitive beings, more considerate beings. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a highly educational and rewarding experience. Thank you so much for your input and your comments and your questions. You guys have been a wonderful audience. I hope you learned something, or I hope you feel more empowered, because we are having this conversation and we want to bring this conversation out there. And we invite you to have this conversation with your peers and your families, your friends, because this is something that it's ongoing and we need to keep working at.
And we invite you to, check out Empodera Clima, our website, or on Instagram if you want to know more, or read Ruth's article that we mentioned today. Just check it out.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And also the presentation is on the Sked app. So if you want to take it with you or you want to keep it, it's there for you. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us through the app, and we're more than happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you so much, everyone.
All right. Thank you so much.